There is a very specific kind of discomfort that shows up the moment a phone starts ringing. Not a loud panic, not a dramatic reaction, just a tightness in the chest, a split second of dread, a reflexive thought. Why couldn't this be a text? For people who hate talking on the phone, that reaction is immediate and deeply familiar. And yet, it's one of the most misunderstood behaviors in modern communication. People who avoid phone calls are often labeled as antisocial, anxious, immature, or incapable of handling real interaction. They're told they need to get over it. That phone calls are simple, that everyone does them, that it's easier to just talk. But the psychology of people who hate talking on the phone has very little to do with fear of people, and almost everything to do with how their mind processes control, timing, emotion, and cognitive load. To understand why some people hate phone calls, you first have to understand that phone calls are not neutral. They demand immediate presence, immediate response, immediate emotional regulation. There is no buffer, no pause, no editing, no control over pacing. The moment you answer, you are fully exposed. For some nervous systems, that immediacy is overwhelming. One of the core psychological reasons people hate phone calls is loss of control. Texting, email, and written communication allow for agency. You choose when to respond, how to respond. You can reread, revise, and regulate your tone. Phone calls remove that layer of control completely. You are expected to think, feel, respond, and react in real time. For people who process deeply, this feels like being pushed onto a stage without rehearsal. Another critical factor is cognitive load. Phone calls require simultaneous processing, listening, interpreting tone, planning responses, managing social cues, regulating emotion, and tracking the conversation all at once. For some people, especially those who are introspective, sensitive, or mentally taxed already, this is exhausting. It's not that they can't do it, it's that it costs too much. This is why many people who hate phone calls are perfectly articulate in writing. Their thoughts are clear, their ideas are nuanced. Their communication is thoughtful. The issue isn't expression, it's bandwidth. Another important layer is unpredictability. Phone calls arrive without warning. Even scheduled calls can feel intrusive because once they begin, you don't control how long they last, where they go, or what emotional terrain they cover. There is no graceful exit without social negotiation. For people who value autonomy and predictability, this feels invasive. Text messages end cleanly. Phone calls linger. Another psychological dimension is emotional exposure. Hearing someone's voice adds layers of intimacy that written communication does not. Tone carries emotion. Silence carries meaning. Pauses feel charged. For emotionally attuned individuals, this intensity is draining. They don't just hear words, they absorb mood. This is why many people who hate phone calls say they feel drained afterward, even if the call was pleasant. Their nervous system stayed activated the entire time. There is also a strong connection between phone call avoidance and self-consciousness, but not in the shallow sense. People who hate phone calls are often highly aware of their own voice, reactions, and timing. They worry about interrupting, about awkward pauses, about saying the wrong thing, about not sounding right. That hyper-awareness pulls attention away from the conversation and into internal monitoring. Texting eliminates that pressure. Another overlooked factor is that phone calls remove visual grounding. You can't see facial expressions. You can't read body language. You can't calibrate responses easily. For some people, this lack of visual feedback increases anxiety rather than reducing it. Silence feels ambiguous. Tone feels loaded. Intent feels unclear. So the brain works harder to fill in gaps. Another key psychological truth is that many people who hate phone calls associate them with obligation, bad news, demands, conflict, work, emergencies. Over time, the ringing phone becomes a conditioned stressor. Even neutral calls trigger the same physiological response. This conditioning doesn't disappear just because the call is from someone you like. There is also a relationship between phone call avoidance and boundaries. Phone calls demand exclusive attention. You can't multitask without appearing rude. You can't disengage quietly. For people who guard their time and energy carefully, this demand feels disproportionate. A text respects boundaries. A call challenges them. Another important factor is that phone calls compress social performance into a single channel: voice. For people who rely on pauses, writing, or reflection to express themselves accurately, this feels limiting. They don't like being reduced to spontaneous speech. They prefer precision over immediacy. There is also a trauma-adjacent layer for some people. Phone calls may have been associated with criticism, unpredictability, or emotional volatility earlier in life. Raised voices, sudden demands, emotional intensity. Even if those experiences are long past, the nervous system remembers. Avoidance becomes protective. Another psychological pattern is that people who hate phone calls often value depth over frequency. They don't enjoy casual check-ins that lack substance. Phone calls often feel like forced closeness without context. They'd rather talk deeply when the time is right than engage lightly on demand. This preference is often misread as coldness. It is not. It is selectivity. Another misunderstood aspect is that many people who avoid phone calls are excellent communicators in person. They are engaged, present, emotionally intelligent. The issue is not interaction, it's the medium. Phone calls strip away context while demanding immediacy. That combination doesn't suit everyone. There is also the issue of interruption. Phone calls break focus abruptly. They pull you out of thought, flow, or rest. For people who need long stretches of concentration or solitude, this feels violent to attention. They don't hate people. They hate disruption. Another psychological truth is that phone calls often carry implicit hierarchy. The caller initiates. The receiver responds. For people sensitive to power dynamics, this feels unbalanced. Texting equalizes initiation and response. Another layer is emotional honesty. Some people don't want to perform politeness when they don't feel it. Phone calls require social smoothing, laughter, engagement, responsiveness. When energy is low, this feels inauthentic. Silence is easier. Text is kinder. If you recognize yourself in this, it's important to hear this clearly. Hating phone calls does not mean you are socially incompetent, anxious, or incapable of connection. It means your nervous system prefers communication with control, pacing, and clarity. Another deep psychological reason people hate talking on the phone is that phone calls collapse preparation time. For many individuals, especially those who think carefully before they speak, preparation is not optional. It's how they stay regulated. Writing allows preparation to happen invisibly. Phone calls expose the gap between thought and speech. When someone hates phone calls, it's often because they value intentional communication. They don't want to improvise emotions. They don't want to guess what they feel mid-sentence. They want clarity before expression. Phone calls demand clarity instantly. And instant clarity is not how every mind works. Another layer is emotional sequencing. Many people process emotion after the fact, not in real time. They understand what they felt only once the moment has passed. Phone calls require emotional immediacy, reacting while the emotion is still forming. That mismatch creates discomfort. Texting gives emotion time to settle. Phone calls do not. There is also a strong link between phone call avoidance and self-trust. People who distrust their spontaneous responses prefer written communication because it gives them a sense of reliability. They can check themselves, edit themselves, ensure alignment between what they feel and what they say. Phone calls remove that safety net. Another important factor is conversational asymmetry. Phone calls often favor dominant speakers. Whoever talks more controls pace, direction, and length. For people who are reflective or slower to respond, this creates imbalance. They feel rushed or talked over. Silence on a phone call feels louder than silence in person. Pauses feel awkward. Thinking feels exposed. Another psychological truth is that phone calls often blur boundaries between roles. Work calls bleed into personal time. Personal calls interrupt rest. There's no visual context to signal availability. For people who compartmentalize carefully, this boundary collapse is stressful. A message can wait. A call demands now. Another layer is that phone calls require vocal performance. Tone, inflection, enthusiasm all become part of the interaction. People who are emotionally honest may struggle to perform vocal warmth when they don't feel it. They don't want a fake cheerfulness. Text allows emotional neutrality. Calls demand affect. Another overlooked reason people hate phone calls is memory load. In a call, information must be remembered in real time. Details can't be reread. Instructions can't be reviewed. For people who prefer external memory, lists, messages, written reference, calls feel unreliable. They don't trust memory under pressure. Another psychological element is sensory sensitivity. The sound of voices through speakers can feel intrusive or overstimulating. Volume, pitch, background noise all affect regulation. For sensitive nervous systems, this sensory input adds strain. Another factor is emotional association. Many people associate phone calls with bad news, emergencies, conflicts, demands. Even neutral calls trigger anticipatory stress. The body reacts before the mind has context. This is not irrational, it's conditioned. Another important truth is that people who hate phone calls often value equality in communication. Calls create a dynamic where one person initiates and the other must respond. Texting distributes power more evenly. Both sides choose when to engage. For people sensitive to autonomy, this matters. Another psychological layer is internal pacing. Some people need silence between sentences, between thoughts. Phone calls don't allow much silence. Silence feels like failure, so people rush to fill it, often before they're ready. That rushing feels bad. Another overlooked aspect is emotional leakage. On the phone, emotion leaks through the voice even when you don't want it to. Fatigue, irritation, uncertainty. For people who prefer emotional containment, this feels exposing. Texting contains emotion. Calls reveal it. Another reason people avoid phone calls is that they don't scale well emotionally. A 5-minute call can feel longer than an hour of texting. The emotional cost is concentrated. For people managing limited energy, this cost feels disproportionate. Another psychological truth is that phone calls require surrendering control over endings. Ending a call requires negotiation, excuses, timing. For people who dislike social maneuvering, this is stressful. Texts end cleanly. Calls require choreography. Another layer is that many people who hate phone calls are deeply considerate. They don't want to interrupt. They don't want to impose. They don't want to demand attention. Calling someone feels intrusive to them, so receiving calls feels equally intrusive. They project their own boundaries outward. Another important factor is identity. Some people simply do not experience themselves as voice first. Their inner world is structured in text, image, or thought, not sound. Speaking aloud feels secondary to thinking. This is not dysfunction, it's difference. Another psychological truth is that people who hate phone calls often come alive in environments where communication is deliberate. Long emails, thoughtful messages, scheduled conversations, in those contexts, they thrive. The problem is not connection, it's spontaneity without consent. Another layer is emotional safety. Phone calls can escalate quickly. Misunderstandings happen faster. There's no buffer to cool down. For people who value emotional stability, this risk feels too high. Another overlooked aspect is that phone calls demand full presence. You can't partially engage. For people who already feel stretched thin, that demand feels overwhelming. If you are someone who hates talking on the phone, the most important thing to understand is this. Your discomfort is not immaturity. It is information. It tells you how your nervous system prefers to communicate. The goal is not to force yourself into comfort with phone calls. The goal is to respect your communication style while staying flexible when necessary. Avoiding phone calls entirely may limit connection. Forcing phone calls may create resentment. The balance lies in choice. Understanding the psychology behind hating phone calls replaces shame with clarity. It reveals that communication is not one size fits all, that depth, honesty, and presence can exist without real-time speech, that some minds need space to speak truthfully. You don't hate phone calls because you're incapable of connection. You hate them because you value control, clarity, and emotional regulation. And once that is understood, the pressure lifts. You're not broken. You're precise. You're not avoidant. You're selective. You're not antisocial. You're attuned. And when you do choose to speak, on the phone or otherwise, it's not noise. It's intentional.